Hello, my name's Harold Halfdan, and welcome to Archaeological Minecraft. I'm a former archaeologist who enjoys playing Minecraft and thought it would be fun to combine the two. In today's episode, we'll be finishing up the Roman Amphitheater of Pompeii, and we'll be talking all about gladiators and other events that took place in these ancient combat arenas. Before we jump too far into this episode, I did want to say that I tried to make this video as standalone as possible, so you could watch this video without watching part 1, although I certainly appreciate if you would watch part 1 at some point. But if you want to learn more about how amphitheaters were built and watch me build the structures you see around me, please feel free to check out part 1 of this miniseries on my channel. As I mentioned in my first video, gladiators and combats within the amphitheaters are an iconic part of the Roman Empire. But before I jump right into starting to talk about gladiators, I want to talk about some of the other events that occurred in the games in the amphitheater, because it wasn't all about the gladiators. While that was certainly the selling point to the crowds and perhaps the climax and high point of the games, the majority of the time during the games held during these events were not taken up by gladiators fighting, but rather there were other events such as animal hunts, executions, and recreations of mythological events. Turning first to the animals, and there really isn't any way around this, animals were slaughtered at an astounding rate in these gladiatorial games. According to ancient sources, 5,000 animals were killed on the opening day alone of the Colosseum, and it's estimated that around 9,000 animals over the whole of these opening events were killed. Over time, there were so many animals killed in Roman amphitheaters over the span of their history that numerous entire species of animals were captured and hunted to extinction. There were whole trade networks set up to round up animals and transport them back to Rome or other amphitheaters around the empire. In these animal events, some of them were animal-on-animal combats, others were hunts between animals pitted against people, and yet others were hunts where trained hunters would hunt different animals for the amusement and entertainment of the crowds. Speaking to some of the animal-on-animal hunts, some were logical kinds, with animals like lions hunting their native prey or a deer trying to escape hounds. Others were one type of carnivore against another type of carnivore, like lions against tigers. Others were really more bizarre. The ancient writer Dio Cassius, a Roman historian and senator who lived from around AD 165 to around AD 235, described one fight where elephants were pitted against cranes in the arena, which frankly is something I'm having trouble wrapping my mind around. Even how that would have worked, or why you'd want to see elephants fighting cranes. Dio writes also that the Colosseum was flooded for the purpose of the games, though in modern scholarship there's some doubts if he's even correct in that, or if it did occur like he described, how that would even have been achieved. Other ancient writers like Suetonius, who lived from around AD 69 to around AD 122, pointed out that water events did occur, but not in the amphitheaters themselves, but rather were held at another nearby location. Some of these water events were described as animal combats that occurred in water with the animals swimming around and fighting each other. Other water events were described as ship battles to reproduce well-known naval combats that occurred in history that presumably would have been familiar to the audiences. I think these mock naval recreations couldn't have possibly have been held in amphitheaters themselves, as some of the figures described by these ancient writers indicates that 3,000 combatants sometimes participated in them. The amphitheater arena floor couldn't have held that many combatants, let alone have supported water deep enough for those types of ships to have sailed around and done their mock naval battle. There were also mock land battles or hypothetical combats between different cultures or types of peoples, which is a theme that we'll also see in the naming and types of gladiators, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. The Roman poet Martial, who lived from around AD 39 to 102 AD, also wrote a work of poetry specifically outlining the opening games at the Colosseum. In it, he outlines a different sort of entertainment that occurred in the amphitheater that wasn't specifically combat related, but instead had to do with public executions, with a twist. In it, he described the amphitheaters in these gladiatorial games as a chance to recreate well-known mythological stories. Some of these stories included the executions of criminals that were induced to participate in these plays that sometimes led to their own deaths. One such event was of a criminal who was both playing the part of a well-known bandit who was crucified while also making reference to the myth of Prometheus. In the Greek myth of Prometheus, Prometheus was condemned by the gods for bringing fire to humans and teaching them how to use fire. As punishment, he was chained to a rock for all eternity, and every day a vulture came and pecked out his liver. In recreating this myth and the historical punishment of this well-known bandit, a criminal was made to recreate it by being crucified himself, thus being bound to an object, like Prometheus, and instead of a bird pecking out his liver, a Highland bear was brought from Scotland who was set loose on the man being crucified, who tore out its innards. All of this is pretty gruesome stuff, and to think it took place in front of tens of thousands of people, all watching in the amphitheater, is pretty astounding. It really makes you wonder how much seeing death and casual violence affected people. This analysis and description from Marshall assumes the audience to some extent would have been familiar with these myths or historically recreated events, and that there was a fascination or interest in seeing them recreated in front of their eyes. Or perhaps, on the other hand, maybe a lot of this was just completely over the audience's head and they were unaware of the stories or histories and maybe just enjoyed a bear mauling a man being crucified. Who's to say? Beyond criminals being executed while playing the part of mythological tales, there were also executed through beasts or simply being put to the sword. These criminals took various forms, but certainly criminals that were seen as undermining the public order as enemies of the state would have been highlighted. This is likely where a lot of the later Christian focus on Christian martyrs being fed to animals and being executed in the arena came from. Looking at it from a Roman perspective, it was far less about Christians being executed for being Christians. Generally speaking, Romans were very tolerant of different religions and people practicing whatever faith they wanted to. But where there was a firm line was any practice that undermined the state's or emperor's authority. Make no mistake, persecutions did happen, and some Christians were put to the sword or killed by animals during these games, often executed as criminals, but it was, with rare exception, not widespread, holistic, and was very sporadic, place to place, and over time. So, just how frequent were these events? Well, that really just depended. Some emperors and other sponsors who put on the games and paid for the events, called editors, did so quite often. They frequently ran up big debts that they hoped to be able to pay back with spoils from future wars, or business ventures in the connections that they hoped might open by spending lavishly enough to get their name out there more. Think of it like how modern corporations spend on advertising so everyone knows the name of their company. At other times, games or other events were put on to celebrate a victory in war or to celebrate when a family member was successful running for office or when their anniversary of office occurred. These events were quite expensive, with one account I saw in my research saying that for just one of the games described by an ancient writer, that the games cost enough in gold to have qualified that person 9 times over for the minimum financial qualification for a patrician to hold a senatorial seat, or put another way, as much as it would have taken to feed 20,000 plebs or lower-class Romans for a year. It's also important to understand that when the games were put on, they sometimes covered substantial time spans. Sometimes this wasn't just for a week or a couple of days. Rather, some of these games might last for hundreds or more days. These were broken down into smaller chunks of 10 to 15 days, with one description from Dio saying that each of these smaller segments or chunks had around 300 gladiators in each. He also described a main event that lasted specifically 117 days long that spanned from June 108 AD through November 109 AD in his description, where in that event he says there were over 4,000 pairs of gladiators that fought in that main event. Now, all that said, one interesting thought, and I don't know if there's a good answer for it, but it was raised by a couple of historians in my research about how much this lavish spending and the accounts of these spectacular events were the typical reality, or how much of those descriptions are exaggerations, or just the descriptions of the most expensive or the most ostentatious events. I wonder in 2,000 years what people looking back on our modern society will think about the exorbitant spending that occurs in modern professional sports. They might think that every sports event works the same way and never really understand that there's a great amount of scale in the professionalism and athleticism in modern sports, going all the way from the professional level down to Saturday afternoon pickup games or games in schools or universities. I personally wonder if it worked much the same way with gladiatorial games in ancient Rome. Sure, they were the larger-than-life events put on by the emperors in the Colosseum, but I suspect most of the events would have been quite small in local amphitheaters with not-so-exotic animals and not-so-well-trained fighters. As for how these events were put on from a day-to-day basis, we're told from ancient sources that on days that contain the gladiatorial games, they followed a typical timeline over that day. In the morning were the animal hunts, and then during the lunch break around midday, that's when the public executions or the mythological plays took place. Then in the afternoon was when the gladiatorial combats occurred. Now, enough waiting. Let's get to talking about the gladiators. The gladiators wore different forms of armor and sported different kinds of weapons based on the type of gladiator there were. These gladiator types took the form, or in some cases the name, from peoples or cultures that had been conquered and incorporated into the Roman Empire. For example, some of these were the Thracians, with small circular or small rectangular shields, a small sword with a curved blade, greaves and helmet with a side plume. Another was the Samnite, which had a short gladius, a rectangular shield, greaves, and a helmet. The Gaul, which was later changed to the Murmillo, as it had a fish on its helmet. And these were heavily armed and armored with a helmet, an arm guard, greaves, a tall oblong shield, and a gladius. And the Retiarius, or the net fighter. They carried a trident and a net and didn't have a helmet, but did have a shoulder shield to help protect the neck. And that's just some of the types. I'm not going to go through all of them. But no doubt having these different types of gladiators pair off help keep the attention of the crowd, as well as help keep track of who was who, so they could more easily follow the gladiator they were rooting for. And some people very much did root for specific types of gladiators and were fans of their type of fighting style. There were also other people out on the arena floor beyond the gladiators, such as their trainers, as well as umpires and stretcher bearers to carry off the injured and dead gladiators, who would sometimes be dressed as gods of the underworld. There was also sometimes a blacksmith and a forge right on the arena floor to be able to repair weapons and armor right there on the spot so fights could continue. Speaking to the actual gladiatorial fights, there's actually quite little regarding a first-hand account of an actual gladiatorial combat between gladiators. There seems to be, from what I've been able to research, just a single description of an actual gladiatorial fight. In this description, which occurred during the opening games of the Colosseum and was described by Martial, two gladiators squared off one against the other. Based on his description, the fight was so stupendous and the combatants so closely matched that it ended in a draw. The Emperor Titus, who was putting on the games, granted each of the gladiators their freedom. And that's one of the important clues and characteristics about the gladiators. Gladiators were slaves. Gladiators were a contradiction in Roman society. On the one hand, as I just mentioned, they were slaves, often taken in captivity during one of the many wars or conflicts Rome had with its neighbors. They were owned by their trainers, and based on ancient sources, it's been estimated that the average lifespan or career of a gladiator would only be about 5 years. However, if a fight got to the point where the sponsor or editor of the games had to choose if they lived or died, they typically would have reimbursed the trainer for the costs of their dead gladiators. In other words, for their dead slave. Basically, gladiators were property, and if that property was lost in the arena, money had to change hands to repay the trainers for that lost property. On the other hand, and this is why I said it's a contradiction, it's that despite being a slave and thus the lowest of the low in Roman society, if they were good, could often become quite famous. Gladiator images and fight scenes appear on frescoes and Roman villas, as well as decorations and ornaments on Roman vases, cups, and other pottery. Here's an example of one such vase. Technically, it's a beaker that has a gladiator fight scene on it. On it, you can see the gladiator, a secutor, fighting a retiarius who's lost. You can see his trident laying on the ground there in front of him. And he's holding up his finger in the air, signaling that he's asking for clemency for his life to be spared. A good comparison to the fame that ancient gladiators had were really comparisons to modern-day sports superstars, and they really were the modern-day sports superstars of their day. In fact, some gladiators became so famous that there had to be laws put in place prohibiting senators or people of the patrician or upper classes from participating as gladiators in the games, as there was fear that they might become so popular that with their rank and then their additional fame, it might unbalance the norms and balance of power. That's why it was so scandalous for the Emperor Commodus to have fought in the amphitheaters in the gladiatorial games. Not that his life was probably in any real danger, at least when he was in the arena itself fighting, but because he fought as a gladiator and was the emperor, that in part is what led to his assassination. At the end of his reign, he intended to celebrate and bring in the new year, AD 193, with games of himself being both a consul, one of the political leaders of Rome, and a gladiator. But some of the people who were his rivals realized they were on the list of people he intended to have executed at the games. And so late in AD 193, before he could take action against them, they had him assassinated. So as I finished up this build, I realized there was a couple things I neglected to point out in the first video. And so I want to spend a little bit of time here talking about that now that the build is all finished up. So first off, I want to fly over here and point out this little gem that I replicated in this build, but also appeared in the actual amphitheater of Pompeii. So there was little carved areas in the stone going down the entrances where posts could be put up to redirect traffic from an in and out perspective. So essentially they had ancient stanchions, kind of like what you'd see at an airport to control traffic. I thought that was just so neat that I wanted to make sure to point that out, that none of these ideas that we think are new and modern, oftentimes they aren't. The other thing I wanted to point out is over in this area, there was a section on the backside of the actual amphitheater where the slope of the hill it abutted and went right up against elevated, and there were stairs going up, so you could just walk right into the upper levels where the plebeians would sit. So not every single entrance was up a artificial flight of stairs. Sometimes they were right up against the hill. Now this area in the real Pompeii was right up against the city walls. And so if you would imagine, let's fly up here on top. See if I can't not fall off there. Okay. The other thing I wanted to point out is in the real Pompeii, there was a street that ran down. The city would be over in this area mostly, and then there would have been a gate here for people coming in from the outside, and then a gate over on this side coming in from the outside with the city walls wrapping around and wrapping around this way. And so the main street came down, met up like I replicated here, and then continued on with the city over in this direction. And then the other thing I wanted to point out is I built these really to replicate what an ancient fresco of the actual Pompeii looked like. And I'll pop that up on screen so you can see that as well. And you can see that around the amphitheater of Pompeii, there were these little covered shops that essentially acted as shop fronts for people. And so that's where I got the inspiration for this design here. Well, that wraps up this video. I hope you enjoyed my recreation of the amphitheater at Pompeii and the chat about gladiators, games, and different events that were held in the arena. Next video, I'll be meeting up with some of my server mates here on the Archaeo SMP and having some combat related events of our own, messing around and having some fun. So if you're curious to see how terrible I am at PvP, please check out that upcoming video. And again, if you're curious to see how I built this structure around me, you can check that out in part 1. As always, I put some resources I uncovered while doing my research for this video in the descriptions, so you can check them out if you want to learn more. Make sure you take the time to like the video and subscribe and all that stuff. And if you did like this video, you might like some of these other ones I'm going to link up here on the screen about different ancient topics. Thanks, have a good rest of your day, bye for now.